Hi, this is Richard Dunn for Evoker. In this video we're going to create snow. So we're going to create a particle effect that is basically a snowstorm. The reason I'm doing a snowstorm and not snow that's just falling down vertically without any wind is because once you know how to do it for a blizzard, it's pretty easy to do it for a straight windless environment where the snow's just drifting down. It'll be exactly the same as the rain that we do later. You just need to apply some of the theory that you learn here. So we'll talk about doing a blizzard because there's a little more involved in it and it will teach you more. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our snow texture. Now you can use a snowflake pattern for your texture, yes, but it's going to be inefficient because a snowflake has a lot of detail in it, and that's going to result in the need to have a higher resolution texture. So there is the option that you could create two emitters, one for the close to the camera and one further away from the player. If you want to do that, feel free to create two textures, one about 512 with a snowflake and one that's just a circle for distance. We're just going to go with doing the circle one. So by now you should be able to figure that out. So let's just create a new texture. We're going to make it just 512 for now. And we're going to just make sure our white brush is at full. And we're just going to center that brush and we're just going to hit the bracket key. And we need to allow some room for blur. So we'll just come down a little bit more and we'll just paint a white dot like so. Now remember the overdraw thing that we talked about earlier, where all this black is going to contribute to overdraw and excessive rendering. What we can do now is we can blur this out and just get a sense of how much space we need to actually allow for the blur itself. So we bring up info and we watch here. So we have greys and we go to black about there. So we've only got a fairly thin border. So we don't need to be that hard on it. What we're going to do now is we're going to just line this up again. Let's just go a little bit bigger. That's too much. Probably there. So let's blur that again. Maybe give it a little bit more. And we'll try that. And we have zeros. So we're good. So that would be an optimal snow texture. You do want to blur it a little bit. So what we're going to do now is we can try and size this down and just see if we can maintain that black in the edge. So let's just take this down by 50%, down to a 256, and just check it again. Yes, we have black, we still have black, and we have an image that's now 256. Let's go down one more time. We want to get this as low as we can. So we're starting to get pixelation here. But this can actually work to your advantage with a snowflake. When you get enough of this pixelation, it actually starts to kind of look like a snowflake with all those lattice structures around the edge. So let's go down far enough. One more time. And let's see what we get there. Still getting black, just 64-bit, 64 pixels. So that's a pretty small texture and very, very optimal for this sort of particle where we're going to have hundreds of thousands of particles potentially on the camera at once. So let's save this. and let's call this snowflake. And remember, we have no alpha, so it's 24-bit. Okay. Now we're back in UDK. Let's import that texture. Snowflake. And let's make it a texture grouping so we can find it by typing in texture, compression, no alpha. Now you can see here, if you look, hopefully this resolution picks it up, but you can see you're starting to get the effect of a broken up edge when you look at it at a lower resolution like this. And this is what I mean by, it's very subtle, but it does start to actually look kind of like a snowflake just by being very, very pixelated. So what we're going to do now is just create a very, very simple material. Now the easiest way to do this is to reuse things that you've already made. Now you might remember the material we made for the embers. We can reuse that. So what we're going to do here is going to go back to the embers material. There it is there. And we're just going to create a copy of this. And we're just going to call this snow. Right click, save. So what we'll do now is we'll open this up, and we're just going to swap this texture out with the one that we just created. So we'll select that, come back in here, and just load the selected. And there it is there. We'll just click those to update. These little boxes are telling the node to update the changes made further down the chain. So now that we have our snowflake in place, there it is there. So by the time you get back there, not so noticeable, but up close it just has a little bit of a nice edge to it. So we can save that, and we're done with the material. So what we're going to do now, of course, is make the actual particle system. So let's just, with the material selected, let's just go right click, new particle system. It's a particle, and we're going to call it snowstorm. And our particle editor has opened. And we have our default terrain in there, which we're going to leave this time. And we have our emitter spawning our snowflake material. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to go through these tabs one at a time. We don't actually need to add that many nodes to this time. We're going to add one or two. That's about it. So the first thing we're going to do is come into required, come into your emitter settings, make sure that your material is loaded. We need to set this setting here, the screen alignment, to velocity. So we'll set that to velocity. And we're going to come down to duration. And we want to set this to a little bit higher than that. So we'll try 2 for a start. Then we're going to jump into our spawn settings, and we're going to give this a very, very high number. Let's type in 10,000. Now at the moment they're all on top of one another, but we'll get to that soon. Next we'll look at lifetime. We'll set this to something like 1.5 for min, and we'll set it to a max of 2.5. That's about the right amount of time. Now these are going to be traveling much faster than this and a lot smaller. Next thing we want to tackle is their size. So we'll just make some more room here. Let's take the maximum size at 10. And we'll zero that out just to be neat. And we'll set these at 5 and zero out the Z. Remember, what we're doing here is we're essentially resizing an image like we do in Photoshop. We're doing the height and the width. So we don't need the Z because they're billboards. They're only a 2D plane, so they don't need the third vector. So it's always a good idea just to zero out the ones that you don't need. All this sort of optimization does pay off in the end, even if it's just a tiny bit, but collectively it can add substantially less memory to the process. Next, we have initial velocity. So for initial velocity, we're going to have to start putting in some rather large figures. So for the max, let's type in 2200 in both directions. And let's leave that bottom one at 10. This is going to give us just a little bit of altitude as the snow is moving through the air. It's going to go up a little bit. Think of this as like a degree, whether it's going straight out or straight up. If we increase that to 45, you can see it's fanning out more. Hope you can see that. So we'll just set that to 10. It looks like a snowmaker at the moment. So it's all coming from one point. So we need to set these values as well. We'll do 1100 here, minus 250. The only way to arrive at the values that you like here is just to try different things until it looks right. There's no right or wrong way or right or wrong figures. Just experiment with it. As you can see now, we're starting to get the beginnings of the effect. And last of all here, we'll type in 650. Now, as we said before, this snow is being spawned from a single point. In fact, if we look at it there, we can actually see it's radiating out. You can see the circles. It's radiating out from about here. And of course, we don't want that. We want this snow to spawn from potentially a fairly large and visible surface. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go and add a location sphere. And we're going to spawn from this sphere. So let's go down and have a look at it by turning on its visibility. And there it is there, that green wireframe that you can see. So let's set that to a much larger number. Let's try 1200. As you can see, if we get back from this and just ignore what's going on over there, what you see there looks pretty much like a snowstorm. The only thing that needs to be tweaked is the scale of the scene. Now that could depend on how you're using it. It could depend on how far away it is from you. In this case, I think we're going to take this down by a tenth to 120. No, that's too little. Let's try 500. That's pretty good. Now we need to look at these settings. We need to uncheck so we don't spawn in Z. We don't want to spawn vertically, we only want to spawn horizontally. We also want this to be based on velocity. If you remember, we changed it back in here to velocity. So we need to mirror what we've done there here. And we're just going to uncheck those two as well. Again, this is just a case of experimenting. Having these set up differently will just give you a different look, but it won't be wrong. It's just giving you the look that you want and the behavior of the snow that you want. I'm pretty happy with that. I could go a little bit higher. Let's go to 800. I'm going to go to 700. Just nailing down to the area that you want to spawn from. Just constant iteration and experimentation. Okay. The next setting we want to look at is down here at start location. Let's try 250. Leave that at 0 and minus 125. As you can see, that's just evened it out. So we're no longer getting particles coming from one point. You don't want to have too many particles on the screen while you're trying to configure the behavior like this. You're better off getting it right and then upping the spawn rate as needed later, or creating several emitters in a group once you're in the actual level. We'll cover that when we get to the rain. So that's starting to look pretty good. Next we've got color over life. Well, snow's generally white, so we're going to leave that at the default. You could make it a little bit blue if you wanted to. Of course, you've got to remember that this XYZ is now representing RGB. So if you were to zero out these or give these a very, very low number and increase the strength of the B, you will ultimately make this blue. Let's just demonstrate that. As you can see there, we've just gone to 10 on blue, and you can see our snow is now, if we slow it down, which you can see, by the way, I'm using that speed control here to slow the sim down. Look, it's in slow motion. So you can see our snow has taken on a slightly blue glow. I actually don't mind that, but it's too much. So let's just go to 3, just give it a little hint. Here we go. And lastly, we want to add the node that we used in our embers to create the spiraling circling effect. We want to use that in here to create the effect of turbulence. So we're going to use the orbit node. So let's go in here and add it. And let's just see what we get. Right off the bat, we are seeing a little bit more turbulence. Probably enough, but let's go in and play with that a little bit. So remember our offset. Our offset amount is how far is it orbiting from the center. So we could type in 50, 50 and 50. Let's type in 25 for this. It's already a lot better. We could also look at our rotation amount. Now, remembering the rotation amount is what percentage of a full circle is the orbit taking place in. Is it traveling in a range up to 360 degrees? As you can see here, let me get this back. 0 is none, 0.5. So it's basically a constant vector, 0 to 1, representing 360 degrees. So ideally, we want to have all these settings just left at 1. And they are. The min, however, is set to 0. Let's try and just put that to 1 on all of them and see what it looks like. It actually looks really good. So we're going to leave that. And the rate is the speed of the rotation. As you can see there, it's a very similar thing to the rotation itself. So we're going to just up this to 0.5 here. So we've got some undulating happening. It's starting to bounce. Not liking that. So we're going to put that back to 0. And that's actually it. So as far as the snow goes, that's finished. So what we can do now is we can just drop that into our scene. So let's add this to our scene. Drag that in here. And we have a blizzard. Now keep in mind that this looks out of place because normally you would want this in a snowy environment, and we could copy several of these around, not too many, but a few. As you can see, it is pretty convincing. And the cost of these, because there's no overdraw or virtually no overdraw on these, if we come into shader complexity and get this against the sky, we can see here against the sky that we've got thousands and thousands of snowflakes. If we go into shader complexity, they're not even showing up. They're pretty much free, graphically speaking. There's the processing of the actual particle, but graphically they're nearly invisible. If we go into wireframe, we can see them all there, but they're actually not contributing anything to the shader complexity, which is what you want. So that's a fairly simple example. Now snow that's just falling gently, that would be almost exactly the same thing, except we remove the orbit module and just have the velocity of the snow going straight down in Z and bring the speed back. So in conclusion, that's how we would create a blizzard snowstorm effect. So in the next lesson, we'll move on to doing a procedural rain that also has the water splashes on the ground based off when the rain actually hits the ground or any other meshes for that matter. So it's a fully procedural rain system. Thank you.